So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our co-host and moderator, Doug Simon. Doug is CEO of DS Simon Media and President-elect of PRSA New York. He works with senior leaders at brands and nonprofits to advise and execute issues based on broadcast and social media campaigns. Doug.
Great. Thanks, Judith, and welcome everyone. Pretty fired up here. It should be very exciting. And let's just get right into it with Truth on Trial, Implications for Communicators, Ethics, and the Collapse of Institutional Trust. I'd like to welcome all of you here in this room, and also those watching online through Compro and through our various social media sites through Social Media Live. Ty Cobb recently retired from the government, where, as you might know, he served as the special counsel to the president, managing the White House response to the Office of Special Counsel. Previously, Ty was a longtime leader of the law firm Hogan Lovells, where he was widely recognized as one of the premier white-collar Securities and Exchange Commission enforcement and congressional investigation lawyers in the entire world. My co-host for today is Richard Levick. He's chairman and CEO of Levick and is one of the communications industry's most important spokespersons and thought leaders, as well as co-host of the event, as I mentioned. He's a powerful advocate for strategic initiatives that companies really must pursue in today's perilous environment. And Mr. Levick has co-authored 5 books, including The Communicators, definitely relevant to the audiences in this room and those watching outside. So, Ty, I'd like to get started with you. Imagine that if I had introduced you by saying, Ty Cobb was the attorney for 11 members of the Clinton White House, helping them navigate through multiple investigations, instead of referencing your recent work at the Trump White House. Do you think there might be a visceral difference in how people responded to you, and have you been experiencing that among colleagues and friends?
You'd be right, but you'd be incomplete. On the visceral experience, yes, there's a visceral reaction. There was a visceral reaction when I did represent the Clinton White House and many of the people there, and there was a visceral reaction to being on this job. But it's politics and government are contact sports, and you have to be ready to do that. And you're going to make some mistakes, and you're going to get chewed up for it, but you got to be prepared to put one foot in front of the other and come back the next day.
Yeah, and Richard, what's your take now on sort of how just someone's perceived role dramatically changes how they're perceived?
Well, I suspect for all of us who are veterans of communications, I've been at this for about 40 years, it's different now than it's ever been before. There's just an absence of trust, and how we gather information, or epistemology, if you will. We draw conclusions first, and then we gather information afterwards, which I think gives us an extraordinarily low trust environment and makes it difficult to communicate at the political level, at the business level, even at the personal level.
Yeah, and Ty was kind enough to provide me with this as an example when we discussed the whole idea of the different roles you play and how you're perceived. This is from 2006. It was from the website Right Wing Nut House. And what they said is, what is significant about Mr. Cobb is that he defended some of the highest profile criminals in the Clinton administration, et cetera, and so on. So as you can see, it's quite different. And one of the things Ty was willing to do, which is excellent from my perspective and hopefully from yours as well, is sort of give us a little bit of an inkling of the process. Obviously, he's limited in terms of what he's allowed to talk about, but sort of the process of being White House counsel, special counsel, different roles, and how that works.
Well, there are a lot of different roles in the White House counsel's sphere and in lawyering at the White House. Ambassador Eisen was, ethics chief for President Obama for years, and that's a very important function. I worked very closely with President Trump's ethics counsel virtually on a daily basis, because ethics has really risen to the top of the triage when you're trying to solve a problem. In my role, because many of the White House counsel lawyers had been significant participants in the Flynn events and the Comey events, they recused themselves. The White House counsel made a decision to recuse his entire office. As a result, in order to manage the White House response, I came in and interacted between the White House and the Office of Special Counsel, handling their document requests and then arranging for White House people to be interviewed, negotiating the terms under which documents were produced, the protections necessary, and the same with the interviews.
Yeah. Do you think possible confusion about that role can add to difficulties from a communications perspective? Maybe, Richard, you can also weigh in on this.
Well, I would say it certainly did in our situation, because the President had personal counsel. President had personal counsel as well, and it was often in the press they didn't distinguish between my role representing the White House and their role representing the individual.
Yeah, and Richard, you've also discussed, if you want to jump in there first, and then I'll have a follow-up.
No, go ahead and ask your question. It's always nice to have the right answer for the right question.
Thank you for that, much appreciated. So hopefully I'll set this one up for you. And basically what I'm looking is the role of the attorney in the communications mix growing based on what's going on in the communications environment and political environment?
Well, it's changed a lot. I know Scott Sobel's here in the audience, and he and I go back many years working with lots of attorneys over the last 30-some years. And attorneys were really reluctant to get involved in communications. When we first started doing communications for law firms, lawyers couldn't understand even being in the same room with attorneys from different firms to talk about topical issues. That's obviously changed, and lawyers are much more willing to be part of the communications. The great irony is that communicators are increasingly less willing to communicate because there's so much liability. We have extraordinary transparency now. There's a greater fear of representing countries because that's all public under FARA, which is the Foreign Agency Representation Act, so it's all public. Your lobbying activities, Lobbying Disclosure Act, which means everything is transparent. One of the times we had to actually get security in our building was in being involved in the Nigerian Boko Haram Bring Back Our Girls campaign. The level of threats are extraordinary. I know Simon Newman's going to talk about the threats that he received. I'm sure, Ty, that you received many. And it gets more and more difficult because of all the personal attacks. And I think we look to retreat a little bit, and actually communicators are reaching out to lawyers more often and asking, how can we be protected?
So what's the solution? Is it possible to dial it back, maybe depoliticize the system? And how do we get from where we are now to there?
So I guess my view on that is there's no need to depoliticize. I mean, politics is an important part of what makes America, and exchanging ideas, theories, concepts, reactions to events in a civil way, participating in the democratic process, voting, going out and putting up posters for somebody. Those are really important things that, in the 50s, when Leave to Beaver was on and I was a child, people could sit around the table, Democrat and Republican, and share ideas, share reactions to people's character, without fear of recrimination or isolation or the fact that their neighbor would never come see them again. You can't do that today. It's amazing the strain that is put on relationships. The obstacles to getting good people to run for office because they're going to be demonized. It's something that should concern us all, and you have a lot of hate and hubris that intrudes, particularly on cable, on both sides. Less so as CBS and ABC, because I think people look to cable for the food fight. But I don't think you depoliticize. I think you just stop, hating. I think you stop demonizing people. I think you prevent facts as opposed to sensationalized facts or weaponized facts.
Yeah, and it seems difficult even to get people to agree on what facts are. That's a challenge.
Well, first of all, I was afraid today that I would get asked the question, what do we do to sort of try and bring back to a higher level of civility? And Ty and I go back a long way, and I'm so delighted he's here, but he's given me great hope, because now I know if we just bring back Leave It to Beaver, I think that we can resolve all of our challenges. I think that there are a few things that make start to put this on the scale of hopelessness as opposed to hope, and I'm so reluctant to say that. But, if we go back to the Nixon administration and Pat Buchanan, the Southern Strategy memo, for smart political reasons, Pat Buchanan said we can divide the country in half as long as we have the larger half. But through all of that, we had an extraordinary relationship amongst the parties. And then you have the church committee, in terms of open, which actually precedes that by a couple of years, openness in government. The unintended consequence of transparency is we're campaigning 24/7. So congressmen who used to know each other, and they stayed during Johnson's time at the same hotels and shared restrooms and knew each other well, and therefore had relationships, doesn't exist anymore. I don't know how to pull back greater trust, and I think the most frightening thing is David Brooks's column in the New York Times a couple of months ago when he talked about once you remove soft power, that is the bumpers on civility, as happened with Berlusconi in Italy, you don't bring it back. And I'm not sure how far we have to keep going on this arc of history before we get back to, if you'll forgive the inclusion of Buddhist counsel here, but to love and trust where we first accept people and learn from them rather than demonize and put them under distinct ideologies and therefore don't have to listen to them.
Yeah. Okay.
And as a Buddhist, I would agree with that. I think that's absolutely right. And this goes to one of the other issues that we had talked preliminarily about is, trust in institutions. People talk about, trust in institutions, the lack of trust in institutions today like it happened yesterday. It didn't happen yesterday. I mean, there were issues in going back to Kennedy when, the Cuban Missile Crisis was misrepresented as a complete victory for the U.S. when, secret to the world was the fact we withdrew missiles from Turkey and came within, one vote on a Russian submarine of whether they were going to fire nuclear missiles. Nobody knew that for years. In the Nixon administration, you've got, in Johnson, you've got Vietnam, which tore the country apart, drove a big wedge between government and young people, and had a great impact on families and people thinking for themselves and protesting. And you had Nixon and Kissinger, lie acknowledged about bombing campaigns in Laos and Vietnam, or in Laos and Cambodia. Those are the kind of things the government really doesn't recover from, and it takes a lot to build trust. And there's been very little trust building since.
Yeah, so let's if I may, just jump into the issue of speculation. So much of our news coverage, and because there's so much space to fill, there might be a news nugget that comes out there. They seem to come out constantly. And from then you'll get, from different perspectives and perceptions, arguing about the speculation of what it really means. Is there a way to turn that temperature down to make things a little more easy about here's what we know, let's try and know more and figure that out? How can that be solved?
No, I don't think there is a way. A couple of thoughts here from a historical perspective. One, we all now have a platform. We all have a megaphone. We are truly in a hyper-democracy when in our whole lives we were in a republic. You were relitigating the election of 1800 between Adams and Jefferson, who so disliked each other personally, but also because of their political positions. One, Adams stood for a republic, a representative form of government. The journalists, the members of government, the financial analysts, that was representative. For the last 20 years, since Al Gore invented the internet, we're now dealing with, that was a joke for those who are not familiar with either Al Gore or 20 years ago. But what's happened now is we all have platforms. We're in Jefferson's view of hyper-democracy, and I'm not convinced that the Jeffersonian cure of the cure for bad speech being more speech works anymore. Two, I think the absence of trust is due to a number of things. One, on the thermometer, we're somewhere past 1968 to 72, the height of the anti-war and civil rights movements, and somewhere approaching 1856 to 1864. There's a lot of anger out there. You can shop at Nordstrom's and somehow be making a political statement that gets you attacked on the internet. So there's this extraordinary level of anger. But it's also, this absence of institutional trust doesn't happen by accident. I think the internet is ultimately brings out the devils in our nature more than the angels, and we're seeing that more and more. And that's a challenge. And then finally, 30 years ago, the Russians, realizing their weakened position, drafted through the KGB, now the FSB, the Gasparov Doctrine. And that said, we cannot no longer compete with the United States, with the West, either through monetary measures, through trade, nor can we do it through militarily. So instead, let us do it by destabilizing trust. It's not an accident that this has happened. It's happening because the combination of the internet and because it's intentional.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, social media, I'm not sure how much progress can actually be made. I think it's a question of trying to limit the damage at this stage of the game. And maybe there'll be a turnaround in another generation, but, it's a death spiral to the bottom at this stage of the game.
Yeah. I just want to say, initially, Richard and Ty were going to be the optimists on the panel. But I guess we'll have to do a bit of a role reversal on
We
that.
have therapists in the back, though, that are available.
Well,
No, but- go ahead.
I'm optimistic because we're having these conversations. I mean, it's important to have these conversations and talk about, is there a way to make things more civil? I mean, yelling on cable TV or yelling generally about how much you hate somebody, or pulling a De Niro or a Roseanne Barr or whatever. Those are the kind of things people aren't listening. I mean, if when you do that, the louder you are and the more offensive you are, they tune you out. I mean, and if and sadly in America today, people silo themselves. They go to their favorite cable show or their favorite news show or their favorite website, and before they go to sleep, and they read through the views there, and that they, feel, validated and comfortable before they go to bed. But they haven't created any grist for the mill. They aren't looking at competing ideas. They're not looking at competing views of somebody's character, personality, platform.
Yeah, and one of the things, and I'm a baby boomer myself, that might be helpful to try and bring some hope is, hang around 15-year-olds or 20-year-olds or the younger end of the millennials, because there's a lot of actual activity and optimism approaching things. There are also some changes in what issues are most important to Americans that might be driving this problem. I saw some Pew Research that just came across from this May, which was very interesting. Going back to 2012, 2014, the dominant issue in elections was the economy. And that seems to be an issue on its face, that everyone's like, we want the economy to be better. There can be broad agreement on that. Now it's down to just 20% feel it's the most important issue. The top issues are dissatisfaction with government, poor leadership. That's at 20, so that's a bunch of people who are really ticked off about that. Immigration, illegal aliens is at 10. That's the third top issue from Pew. Again, a very controversial, competing, wide spectrum of views, hard to meet in the middle. Race relations and racism comes in at 7. Unifying the country was seen as a problem by 5. Ethics, so it's good that we're here. We're speaking to 5% of the electorate right now. Lack of respect for each other, 5%. So people are upset about the divide, and only then do you start getting down to health care, and there's guns, gun control, again, an issue of great conflict. International was only at 3. That was probably before the summit, so maybe now it's at 4 or 5. But how much is it playing that the issues that are on the agenda and that have been set seem to set people up on very opposite sides with the difficulty of meeting in the middle?
I think you answered your own question. And sadly, I think, I think it's fascinating why business has dropped, and the economy has dropped, because much of the media is not talking about the economy, because that's viewed as, pro-Trump, so they will not talk about it. At the same time, the media that is talking about it, Bill Maher, yesterday said, gee, I hope there's a recession, we should have some economic pain because maybe that'll get Trump out of office. That's not the kind of dialogue we need. I mean, all these issues that you talk about, race should be on every list every time there is a list. Okay, that's important. It's important to America. It's important to get that right. Ethics should be on any list because ethics elevates the conversation, and it gets back to the issue of trying to take people seriously, but evaluating them on the basis of ideas, not personalities or or their worst views, their biggest mistakes.
It's fascinating to me that only 5% of the country think that having us more unanimous in some of our national views is important, because I can't think of a time in our lifetimes when we've been more divided than we are now. I think what we're also missing, my favorite 2 words from the Reagan administration were Mary Paris. Mary was a family staffer for Ted Kennedy, and many nights she would go and bring the bottle of single malt to Ted Kennedy's second office, which most people didn't know existed under the Capitol. And there, Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill and Ted Kennedy would drink their single malt after 5 and talk about the day's problems. We don't have that anymore, and I think we do have the single malt, but we don't have the we don't have the conversations that I think are really necessary. I think another Pew number, which is on a different study, is that, and this probably leads to part of the problem. The good news is that only 5% of people believe what they read on Facebook. The bad news is they're lying. And they're lying because what they do is they say, I don't believe what I read from an unknown source, but as soon as a friend sends me something, if Ty sends me something through Facebook which says the moon is made out of cheese, because I trust Ty, I therefore go around and say the moon is made out of cheese. We now base our reality on trusted resources rather than any thought about truth or could that be possible.
Great, and let's jump into implications for communicators at organizations and nonprofits. Increasingly, data is showing that consumers are demanding engagement and involvement by companies. We see Dick's Sporting Goods taking stand, many companies in the news for the stands. Good idea, bad idea? What are some of the best ways to approach that?
Well, I don't think there's any choice. First of all, we're existing, as history goes in cycles. 1909, J.P. Morgan invites the bankers to his library, locks the door, and says, we're not leaving here until we figure out the financial problem. That delayed the recession, the Great Depression, by a decade, and they created the Federal Reserve. You see during historic periods of time levels of mercantile activism in companies entering into the fray. We see that with many companies now, particularly with Starbucks, what they've been doing over the last number of years, what they did in regard to Philadelphia, and what they're doing marching forward. There are no sidelines now. For corporations, they have to be transparent, they have to be consistent. If it's something that is consistent with their financial mission, all the better. So you see Chick-fil-A, which had its position based on Dan Cathay, the former president, in terms of his opposition to LGBT rights, but they were able to maintain that because they were consistent. Patagonia was able to support national parks in Utah because it's part of their financial mission. Lyft, which I think is really fascinating, because what did they do after the president's ban, the Muslim ban, was they donated immediately $1 million to the ACLU. In times past, that would have been seen as political, but now it was seen as leadership, where if you compare that to what Uber did on the president's financial business councils, they did nothing for a while. And they were all about, our position is being edgy in leadership. And when we talk about leadership, when we talk about consistency, when we talk about transparency, I think those companies provide examples of what to do and what not to do.
And Richard and I have worked together in boardrooms around the world over the past 2 decades, and I think we share the view that the most important thing is transparency and getting out in front of a problem. You look at Starbucks, they dealt with it immediately, and they dealt with it big, and they dealt with it because it's part of their culture. You can't have 100 cultural themes, but you can have 4 or 5 that are really important, and you can emphasize them in everything you do. And speed matters, and you contrast that with Wells Fargo. I mean, Wells Fargo is now running this big campaign, apologizing for problems that started 5 years ago. Half the people that are seeing these ads are going, why? What are they apologizing for?
Right.
They don't remember.
Well, they also do a good job not mentioning what they apologize for, which might be part
true.
of it. Yeah, I think
But
that's
speed matters. Speed matters.
Yeah. One quick question as we're going to wrap up this panel and get ready for our next panel. We'll have a short video from Richard Painter when I had a chance to speak to him via Skype in between. But you talk about transparency, and it'd be interesting to hear from the crowd as well later, just by even a show of hands kind of reaction. Is there more transparency or less? It seems in some of the areas there's hyper-transparency. In others, we really don't know what's going on. Do you guys feel there's much more transparency?
So I think in the political world, there is not as much transparency. It's not that more facts aren't getting out there. Far more facts than have gotten out historically are getting out there. But they get opaque in translation because 50% of the population is told one thing, 50% of the population is told another because they get their news from different sources and their social media from different sources. In the corporate world, yeah, things are really happening. Facts are getting out there. That's part regulatory, Rule FD, board liability, and lawsuits and self-disclosure programs that are part of most of the enforcement mechanisms at this stage of the game.
No, I agree. I mean, we have so much transparency now that, I mean, think about this for a moment. Emails are the codification of our conversation. Twitter is the codification of our thinking, what happens between our synapses. And they're all known under the very friendly name as evidence. And as a result, you know, we are facing all sorts of liability, not for what we've done, but for what we've thought, or what we've thought while we were texting someone in the office without giving it much thought. And suddenly that becomes the standard by which we're measured.
Great, and especially to you online, I'd like you folks watching online to give a great hand to our first two guests who started this off as such a phenomenal session. You guys here can do so as well. So thank you, Ty and Richard. That was really fantastic. Richard, you're going to be sticking around, and we'll be joined by Ambassador Norm Eisen and former Robert Mueller Special Assistant Michael Zeldin in a moment. But first, we had the opportunity to speak with Richard Painter. He's former White House Chief Ethics Counsel under President George W. Bush via Skype last week. We spoke to him. He's a prominent critic of President Trump, now running in the Democratic primary for the Senate seat in Minnesota. Let's take a look.